22.95, the Penapindupama Sutta, translated here as the simile of the lump of foam. So, of course, this is one of my favorite suttas. And again, this is one of the classics. This is a really well-known sutta, both in the Theravada world and also outside of the Theravada world, so in Mahayana Buddhism as well. This sutta is quite well known because in this the Buddha gives 5 very clear and poignant similes for understanding the emptiness of mind and body, for understanding the empty nature of every component of our personal experience. So, as usual, I'll read through the sutta and periodically give some explanations. Then I'll take any questions you have at the end. So the sutta begins. On one occasion, the Blessed One was living at Ayodhya on the bank of the Ganges River. There he addressed the monks. Monks, a large lump of foam could be carried along by the Ganges River. A person with eyesight could see it, consider it, and examine it. By seeing it, considering it, and examining it, that person could determine that it was insubstantial, hollow, and essenceless. Monks, what essence can there be in a lump of foam? Monks, in exactly the same way, a monk sees, considers, and examines any physical form, whether past, present, or future, internal or external, coarse or subtle, inferior or superior, far or near. By seeing it, considering it, and examining it, one determines that it is insubstantial, hollow, and essenceless. Monks, what essence can there be in physical forms? So this is the first of the 5 similes that the Buddha gives. So he's talking here about physical objects. So the word rupa also means your body. So our body is the physical object which we tend to be the most personally interested in. But rupa also refers to any kind of physical object. So whether it's a cushion or a wall or a tree or a stone or a star or anything, any physical object can be called a rupa. So the Buddha here he's analogizing it to a lump of foam. So what is a lump of foam? Well, it's mostly air. There's only an extremely thin layer on the outer surface of a lump of foam, which seems to have any substance to it. But when you pay closer attention to it, you realize that there's not really any substance to it at all. Like if you have a bunch of soap bubbles and you grab them in your hand, there's nothing there. There's no solid, persistent core to it. You can see that there's not anything of substance there. So a lump of foam is something which at first glance might look like a solid object. So again, he gives this example. They're sitting by the Ganges River, and he says, well, if you look at this Ganges River, you might see a large lump of foam being carried along. So when you see a large lump of foam, it looks like a white object floating on the surface of the river. But on closer examination, you realize there's not really anything there. So the Buddha says that physical objects are exactly the same way. Physical objects look like solid things. They look like solid, substantial objects. But if we look closely at them with wisdom, then we see that they're insubstantial. We see that there's not really anything here. And there's a number of ways that we can approach this through meditation practice. One of the most direct ways of approaching this is through cultivating the perception of impermanence. So paying very close attention to our bodies, so practicing mindfulness of the body. And once our mindfulness and concentration are very strong, then we observe the constant arising and ceasing of physical sensation. We observe the constant coming and going of the body. We observe how physical phenomena arise and cease in every moment. And we start to realize that there's not really anything here. It's like an illusion. It's like a mirage. It's like a ghost. There's not really anything of substance here. Another interesting thing about the simile, so a lump of foam, what happens when you try to grasp a lump of foam? It disappears, because there's never anything there that you could hold on to in the first place. This also is very relevant to the Buddha's teaching, since the Buddha is constantly talking about non-grasping. So not trying to grab hold of anything, because ultimately nothing whatsoever can be held onto. Nothing whatsoever is capable of being grasped. So this is one of the deep ironies of dukkha, is that we're constantly grasping at things when there's actually nothing whatsoever that is capable of being grasped. So this process of trying to latch hold of something or anything to hold on to is utterly futile right from the beginning. And it's also painful. So the process of grasping is both futile and painful, and yet we keep doing it every single moment of our lives. It would be hilarious if it wasn't so painful. So this is what we're caught in. We're caught in this constant absurdity of trying to grab hold of a lump of foam as though it was something solid and real. The second simile that he gives, so the Buddha says, monks, when it is raining in autumn and large raindrops are falling on the water, a water bubble might arise and vanish. A person with eyesight could see it, consider it, and examine it. By seeing it, considering it, and examining it, that person could determine that it was insubstantial, hollow, and essenceless. Monks, what essence could there be in a water bubble? Monks, in exactly the same way, a monk sees, considers, and examines any feeling. That's Vedana in Pali. Whether past, present, or future, internal or external, coarse or subtle, inferior or superior, far or near. By seeing it, considering it, and examining it, one determines that it is insubstantial, hollow, and essenceless. Monks, what essence can there be in feelings? So this is the second of the 5 Kandas, the 5 components of being. So Vedana is the pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral character of any experience that we have. So this is a mental phenomenon. It's something that happens in the mind. So for example, you have a physical sensation. For example, the sensation of the air. The air itself is not pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. The sensation of air is not pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. However, if the air feels too hot for you or too cold for you, then you might perceive it as unpleasant. If it feels just right, then you might perceive it as neutral. If the air is cool when your body is hot, then it will feel pleasant. Or if the air is warm when your body is cold, then it will feel pleasant. So the air itself is not pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. And the physical data of that experience is not pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. It's the mind that decides it's pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. So it's the mind placing a judgment on a physical sensation. This is what Vedana is. It's the mind evaluating whether it likes, dislikes, or has no particular strong reaction to a sensation. And so the simile the Buddha gives is like when a raindrop falls on the water and produces this brief splash. So what's the nature of this simile? So the raindrop falling on the water, so that's like a sensation contacting the mind. So a sensation is something very fleeting, very quick. And it produces this brief splash, which is then gone almost instantaneously, almost immediately, it's gone. So that's also the nature of Vedana, is that it's constantly happening, rapid fire, every moment is just splash, 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 splash. This constant impact on the mind of a sensation which we perceive as pleasant or as unpleasant or as neutral. There's another wonderful simile the Buddha gives elsewhere of a flayed cow. So a cow whose skin has been completely cut off so that its raw flesh is exposed to the air. And insects are constantly biting at it. This is another simile he gives for Vedana. So Vedana is like the flayed cow that's being constantly bitten by insects. Not a particularly pleasant metaphor, but it's communicating how Vedana has this kind of like rapid fire, almost irritating quality to it. And here, with the image of the raindrops falling on water, what the Buddha is emphasizing is the incredibly ephemeral, short-lived quality of Vedana. How it produces just this brief little splash in the mind, and then it's gone. So there's not really anything there that you can hold on to. There's not really anything substantial or anything important or anything significant. And yet we make such a big deal out of it. So, for example, you might be having a really nice lunch. Maybe one of our neighbors, who's a really good cook, comes over and prepares a fabulous feast with garden vegetables, and you're eating it, and you're like, oh, this is so amazing. This is so wonderful. Splash, splash, splash. It just appears and disappears just like that. And within a very short period of time, that barrage of sensation is over. You can't eat forever. You can only eat for a few minutes, and then you have to stop, or else you'll start getting sick. It actually becomes very unpleasant. I remember a couple years ago, I was in Taiwan, and I'd gone to visit a particular monk, and she had made this amazing noodle soup, and she gave me this giant bowl of noodle soup, and I was just like, wow, this is so great. And I started eating it, and it was really good, and it was really good, and I kept eating, and I kept eating, and there was a lot left in the bowl, but I actually wasn't really hungry anymore. But in that tradition, you're expected to finish the whole bowl. Like, it's considered quite inappropriate to leave uneaten food in your bowl. So I kept going, and it started to become so horrible. It was exactly the same delicious noodle soup, but because I wasn't hungry anymore, it was becoming actually painful. It didn't taste good anymore. Like, all the enjoyment was gone, and it was becoming a struggle. So what's changed? It's still the same physical sensation, but what's changed? What's changed is that we're no longer perceiving it as pleasant. We're perceiving it as unpleasant. So this is the nature of Vedana, is that it's impermanent. It's constantly appearing and disappearing. It's constantly shifting. It's not reliable. So this also is what the Buddha is talking about when he says there's no essence there. He's saying Vedana is not reliable. Something can be wonderful one moment and then terrible the next moment. And what's different is not necessarily the sensation itself, but rather our internal reaction to it. And so this, by the way, applies particularly to unawakened beings, because elsewhere in the suttas, the Buddha mentions that one of the characteristics of an awakened being is that they can perceive, if they choose to, they can perceive the pleasant as unpleasant, they can perceive the unpleasant as pleasant, or they can go beyond pleasant and unpleasant entirely. So the irritating or unreliable nature of Vedana is only a problem for the unenlightened mind. For those of us who make such a big deal about pleasant and unpleasant. Then the third simile the Buddha gives, he says, monks, in the last month of summer, when it's really hot, in other words, a wavering mirage might appear at midday. A person with eyesight could see it, consider it, and examine it. By seeing it, considering it, and examining it, that person could determine that it was insubstantial, hollow, and essenceless. Monks, what essence could there be in a mirage? Monks, in exactly the same way, a monk sees, considers, and examines any perception. whether past, present, or future, internal or external, coarse or subtle, inferior or superior, far or near. By seeing it, considering it, and examining it, one determines that it is insubstantial, hollow, and essenceless. Amongst what essence can there be in perceptions? So perception here is sanya. So sanya also has the meaning of memory, by the way, or identification or recognition. So perception is one of the more common translations of sanya, but we should keep in mind it also has these other meanings. So recognition or identification. So sanya is the internal process through which we identify and label our experiences. So for example, when you see something, initially you're just getting this chaotic blob of visual data. It doesn't actually mean anything. It's just this messy conglomeration of data. Sanya is what sifts through that data and then decides, oh, I am looking at a red meditation cushion. Oh, I am looking at a bookshelf. I am looking at a person wearing a black shirt. Like the mind creates a label for things. So this is sanya. The problem is that sanya is usually distorted because the mind is also sifting through its memories and ideas and concepts and creating some concept of what it thinks it's experiencing. And then projecting that experience onto the reality of it. So a very common example of this is when something first comes into your peripheral vision. When it first comes into your peripheral vision, you can't see it clearly. So you're seeing it just out of the corner of your eye, where your eyesight, your vision is extremely weak and vague. So often what happens is that your sanya will project an image of what it thinks it's seeing. So something comes into the corner of your eye and you think, oh, that's a person. It's like, oh, that's Bhante Sumita coming into the room. But then you turn and look more closely and you're like, no, that wasn't Bhante Sumita at all. That was Ayasoma. Or, oh, it wasn't even Ayasoma, it was Stan, the cat. So the mind generates an image of what it's expecting to see, rather than just seeing whatever's actually there. The problem is this isn't just happening in our peripheral vision. It's happening in our entire sensory sphere all the time. So we're constantly projecting what we think we're seeing. We're constantly projecting what we think we're hearing, what we think we're smelling, what we think we're tasting, which is not necessarily what we're actually seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching. There's been many studies in psychology which have confirmed this. There's one study, I'm trying to remember the details, which they did with taste, where they had people eating something, and then at the same time they were, I think it was displaying images of particular herbs, and then the person would taste that herb in the food they were eating. It's like somebody would be given vanilla ice cream and they'd be showing them images of mint leaves, and the person would say that the ice cream tasted like mint. But in actuality, there was no mint flavoring in the ice cream. Their mind was projecting that illusory taste based upon the concept or the idea that was forming in the mind. Of course, there's many other examples of how we project sensory distortions into our sensory field based upon what we're expecting. Another really common example that's often given of this is car accidents. So car accidents are these very quick, chaotic events. And then afterwards, when eyewitness reports are collected, the eyewitness reports are often dramatically different from each other. So in theory, everybody is seeing the same thing, But in actuality, each person reports dramatically different versions. Like saying, oh, well, the driver was wearing a red shirt. No, the driver was wearing a blue shirt. No, the driver was wearing a yellow shirt. And it's like, oh, it was a white car that ran the red light. No, it was a green car that ran the red light. No, it was a black car that ran the red light. Like everybody has their own version of the event. And this is because each person has their own distorted sanya, their own distorted concept of reality. And it's their concept that they're experiencing rather than the reality itself. So the metaphor the Buddha uses, the metaphor of the mirage, is quite apt, because what is a mirage? A mirage is when we have a visual experience and we misinterpret it. One of the most common forms of mirage, and again, usually this happens on a hot day, you look out at the road and it looks like there's a puddle of water on the road. But then when you get closer to it, the water vanishes and you realize there never was any water on the road. Just from a distance, there was this illusion, this mirage. So you actually were receiving some kind of visual data, and your mind decided that it was seeing a puddle of water. So that's what it saw. Until eventually you got enough visual data that your mind could no longer convince itself it was seeing water. So this is a simple example of a mirage, one which is very common. So this is one of the points where it really emphasizes the importance of having very strong mindfulness. So cultivating a present moment awareness which cuts through our underlying expectations about reality, our underlying assumptions about reality. So always setting aside our assumptions and expectations and training ourselves to see things as they are in each moment and not expecting things to make sense. This is very important. Don't expect reality to make any sense. Just be present for whatever it is. No matter how chaotic or confusing it is, be present with that. If you have no idea what's going on, then just be willing to accept you have no idea what's going on. But be fully present for not knowing what's going on. Be fully present with whatever sensory data you're receiving. So one of the differences between an awakened being and an unawakened being, they both have sanya. The difference is that an unawakened being has distorted sanya, so sanya vipalasa, distorted sanya, whereas an awakened being has pure sanya, purified sanya. Their sanya is not distorted in any way. Their sanya perfectly matches what's actually happening. Then the next simile the Buddha gives, so this is the fourth one. He says, monks, a person who needs heartwood, so heartwood is the solid, hard, dense wood at the center of a tree. Says a person who needs heartwood, who is seeking heartwood, who is searching for heartwood, might take a sharp axe and enter a forest. There he might see a large plantain tree, straight, fresh, and tall. He could cut it down at the base, cut off the crown, and peel off the leaves. While peeling off the leaves, he would not even find sapwood, let alone heartwood. A person with eyesight could see it, consider it, and examine it. By seeing it, considering it, and examining it, that person could determine that it was insubstantial, hollow, and essenceless. Monks, what essence could there be in a plantain tree? Monks, in exactly the same way, a monk sees, considers, and examines any formation, whether past, present, or future, internal or external, coarse or subtle, inferior or superior, far or near. By seeing it, considering it, and examining it, one determines that it is insubstantial, hollow, and essenceless. Monks, what essence can there be in formations? So this is talking about the fourth of the 5 Kandas. So the fourth Kanda is called Sankhara. And Sankhara is one of these really interesting Pali words, which is very difficult to translate into English in any kind of satisfactory way. Formations is a relatively bland translation. There's many other translations, though none of them are quite right. Formations is okay. Constructions is another interesting one. Constructs. Conditional phenomena is a mouthful, but actually very precise. Conditional phenomenon is probably the most accurate English translation I'm currently aware of, but it's a little clunky and awkward. So sankhara, there's two main ways we use the word sankhara. One is in the sense of mental formations, mental phenomena, such as thoughts and emotions. The other is in a much broader sense of meaning any conditional phenomenon whatsoever. So a camera is a sankhara, a computer is a sankhara, a cushion is a sankhara, a fragrance is a sankhara, a sound is a sankhara, an idea is a sankhara, consciousness is a sankhara. So this is sankhara in its sense of any discrete phenomenon, any discrete object. So any distinct object of whether physical or non-physical. So that's the broadest sense of sankhara. But in the context of the 5 kandas, the 5 components of body-mind, sankhara is referring particularly to mental phenomena, mental objects, mental activities. So sankhara, by the way, again, it can mean not just objects, but also activities or processes, functions. So this is an extremely broad term. And all sankharas have 3 common characteristics. So all sankharas, without exception, are impermanent, and therefore ultimately unsatisfying. So you can't get any reliable happiness out of them. And also ultimately impersonal. Since all sankharas are constantly changing, shifting, and vanishing, then they have no lasting essence of their own. And since our sense of self-identity persists despite the arising and ceasing of sankharas, then that means that no sankhara can ultimately be ourself, can ultimately be a permanent part of our self-identity. So here he's talking particularly about sankharas in the sense of mental activities or mental objects, mental processes. And the simile he uses is of a plantain tree. I've never actually seen a plantain tree in my life. Who here has seen a plantain tree in real life? One person? Okay. So apparently a plantain tree doesn't actually have any wood in the center. It's more like a cluster of leaves that grow very densely and tightly together. So it creates the illusion of a tree, but it's actually just this tightly coiled bundle of leaves. So if you start peeling away the leaves, expecting to find a tree at the center of all those leaves, then you'll just peel away leaf after leaf after leaf until there's nothing left. So a more familiar example for those of us who grew up in countries where there's no plantain trees is an onion. So it's similar with an onion. So an onion is made of many, many layers wrapped around each other. So you peel off one layer of the onion, and you peel off the layer under that, 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 and there's nothing there. Eventually you've peeled off all the layers and you're left with nothing. There's no pit, there's no core, there's no substance underneath all those layers. So it's the same with the mind. So we look at the mind and what do we see on the surface? On the surface we see a bunch of thoughts and emotions and activities. And we're like, okay, let's strip off that layer. That's clearly not my true self. My true self is not all these coarse thoughts and coarse emotions and coarse activities. So we strip off that layer. And underneath that you find a more subtle layer of mental activities and mental processes and mental objects. So you strip that off. And underneath that, you find a more subtle layer. So you strip that off. And underneath that, you find an even more subtle layer where the mind is engaging in these incredibly subtle, refined, nonverbal currents of movement. And you strip that away, and there's nothing left. The mind is silent and empty. There's no thinker in the midst of the thoughts. Then the final simile that the Buddha gives, the fifth simile, he says, monks, an illusionist or an apprentice illusionist, this is like a stage magician, could display an illusion at a crossroads. A person with eyesight could see it, consider it, and examine it. By seeing it, considering it, and examining it, that person could determine that it was insubstantial, hollow, and essenceless. Monks, what essence could there be in an illusion? Monks, in exactly the same way, a monk sees, considers, and examines any consciousness, whether past, present, or future, internal or external, coarse or subtle, inferior or superior, far or near. By seeing it, considering it, and examining it, one determines that it is insubstantial, hollow, and essenceless. Monks, what essence can there be in consciousness? So this is the fifth of the 5 components of being, vijnana, consciousness. And vijnana, we normally have the experience of I, like me being conscious of that. So me being conscious of this visual world that I'm seeing. Me being conscious of those sounds, that auditory world. Me being conscious of this tactile world, this experience of this body, and so on. So there is this appearance of me being conscious of not me. And the Buddha says that this is like an illusion. It's like when you go to a magic show and the magician pulls a rabbit out of a hat. And it really, really looks like that magician just made a rabbit appear out of nowhere, pulled a rabbit out of an empty hat. But actually, it's just a trick. It sure looks like a rabbit appeared out of nothing, but in actuality, it's just a trick. So there's, like, this is one of the most well-debunked magic tricks. They have a little tiny compartment inside the hat, which is just barely big enough to squeeze a rabbit into. I feel bad for the rabbit. They squeeze this rabbit into this little tiny compartment inside the hat so that it looks like an empty hat, but actually it has this little hidden compartment with a rabbit in it. Or another one is the old trick of sawing a person in half. So they have a box, like a coffin, and the person gets into it. And then the magician saws it in half, and it looks like they're cutting the person in half. But actually the person inside the box has just curled their body up, like pulled their legs up and curled up into a ball. So again, from the outside, it looks like they're pulling a rabbit out of a hat or cutting a person in half or whatever. But it's just a trick. It's just a misunderstanding of what's going on. And once you understand the illusion, then it no longer has any power over you. Once you understand the trick, then you're not fooled anymore. There's actually a great book on this called Magic of the Mind by Bhante Katukurunde Nyanananda, where he talks extensively about this specific metaphor, the metaphor of the magic trick, and speaks about how this is a way of investigating the illusory nature of consciousness. So if you want more on this specific metaphor, I recommend this book, Magic of the Mind by Bhante Katukurunde Nyanananda. Actually, I recommend everything by Bhante Katukurunde Nyanananda. He was an amazing teacher. Yeah, so consciousness is a natural process, but it's something that we misunderstand its nature. We misunderstand it as being me conscious of that. So we put a self-identity into something that is inherently lacking in self-identity. So then the Buddha concludes the sutta. He says, monks, when a learned disciple of the Noble One sees in this way, one becomes disenchanted with physical form, disenchanted with feeling, disenchanted with perceptions, disenchanted with formations, disenchanted with consciousness. Being disenchanted, one becomes dispassionate. Dispassion liberates. This here is one of my favorite sequences that we see throughout the suttas. So in particular, this simple 4-word statement. So 2 phrases of 2 words each. Nibbindang virajati, viraga vimucchati. Right there is actually a complete summary of Buddhist practice in 4 words. Nibbindang virajati, disenchantment, dispassions. So disenchantment produces dispassion. Viraga vimucchati, dispassion liberates. Very simple statement. So disenchantment, nibbida, is when we recognize that no happiness can be found in any conditional phenomena. Therefore, we stop looking for happiness in conditional phenomena. We recognize that our true self cannot be found in any sankhara, in any conditional phenomenon. So we stop looking. We stop trying to build any kind of self-identity based upon any conditional phenomenon. So when we lose our enchantment with sankharas, we lose our enchantment with conditional phenomena, then our passion for them fades away. We lose our lust for sankharas. We lose our interest in Indian food. We lose our interest in entertainment. We lose our interest in any kind of sensory experience. And we lose our interest also in any kind of mental phenomenon, any kind of thought or emotion or idea, any kind of self-perception. So all of it we recognize as being just as meaningless and absurd as trying to grab a lump of foam. Just as meaningless and absurd as trying to find the pit of an onion. So we stop trying. And so with dispassion, we experience liberation. Liberation from suffering and liberation from delusion. We start to come in touch with the unconditioned. When we drop all conditional phenomena, then we come in touch with the unconditioned, which is the nibbana dhatu. So the element of enlightenment. So the all-pervasive element of nibbana, which is, it's always accessible. It's never anywhere other than here and now. We just don't see it because we're so caught up with sankharas. We're so obsessed with the objects that seem to be coming and going in our experience that we completely miss the element of the unconditioned, the asankata dhatu, the nibbana dhatu, which is, it's always here. It's never anywhere else. So, and then the Buddha continues with the sequence. He says, when there is liberation, one knows liberated. This also is a very important statement. So when one attains enlightenment, one knows it. There's no hesitation or doubt whatsoever in your mind. You know exactly what happened. So there's a certain famous teacher, and I'm not going to name their name. There's a certain famous teacher who originally was Buddhist, but since has wandered off into their own domain, who had some kind of far out experience in meditation, but didn't really understand what it was. And then many, many months later, while reflecting back on it, convinced themselves that that weird experience they had had several months ago was attaining full enlightenment. But of course, this can't possibly be, because if that experience had actually been enlightenment, they would have known immediately, without the slightest shred of doubt, that it was full enlightenment. When one attains awakening, there is no doubt whatsoever that that's exactly what happened. It doesn't take several months to figure it out. You know instantaneously that you've attained awakening. And the Buddha continues, one understands, birth has been eliminated, the spiritual life has been completed, what was to be done has been done, there will be no further existence here. So this is a standard statement of an awakened being. So an awakened being recognizes that they're no longer caught in the cycle of samsara, the cycle of rebirth. They recognize that there's nothing more that needs to be done. They've reached the highest spiritual attainment. There's no further attainment beyond complete awakening. Then the Buddha ends with a poem. So as with so many of the suttas and the Samyutta Nikaya and Anguttara Nikaya, it ends with a poem. So the sutta ends with this, says, this is what the Blessed One said. When this was said, the Sublime One, the teacher, further said this. Form is like a lump of foam. Feelings are like water bubbles. Perception is like a mirage. Formations are like plantain trees. Consciousness is like an illusion. This is what was said by the kinsman of the sun. So aditya bandhu. So aditya means the sun. Literally it means the blazing object. So the sun. Aditya bandhu is the kinsman of the sun. One of these lovely names for the Buddha. So the poem continues. One who considers in this way and wisely examines sees that it is insubstantial and hollow. Referring to this body, it was taught by the One of abundant wisdom that when three things are lost, one sees the body abandoned. Vitality, heat, and consciousness. When the body has lost these things, then it lies discarded and insentient, food for other beings. So here he's throwing in a little mindfulness of death to keep us on our toes. This is the continuity, this illusion which deceives the foolish. It is called a murderer, and here no essence can be found. So here the Buddha is referring to another metaphor that he uses in other suttas, where he refers to the 5 Kandas as a murderer. So like a murderer that's constantly following us around with a raised knife, just waiting for its opportunity. And at any moment it might plunge down the knife. So in the same way, the 5 Kandas, if we identify ourselves as being this body, then that makes us subject to death, because when this body dies, we will think, I am dying. If we identify with anything in the mind, then that makes us subject to death, because all the phenomena of the mind are also constantly dying. So as long as we identify as something subject to death, then we will experience death. So then the last stanza of this poem says, regarding these components in this way, an energetic monk is clearly aware and mindful, whether it is day or night. One should abandon all the fetters and make a refuge for oneself. Live as though your head is on fire, intent upon the path to the deathless. So that's the end of this sutta. So maybe we can have 3 sadhus.
Andamayam Dhammakataya Sadhukaram Dadamase
Sadhu, 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 anumodami.
Thank you so much, Bhante, for sharing that wonderful sutta. Much Dhamma Sukha. And good to see so many friends online, all very interested in this sutta. So there's actually quite a few questions. And hello to Kumu, Geeta, Nancy, Jayanta, Michael, Anita. It's great to see you basically almost every session, if not every session, without maybe the almost. Hello to Mike, Michael Shwe, Ramulo, Gorhel, Amaranta, Rinchen, lots of friends. Anita says, Bhante, can you please share some ideas of or your experiences in transcending the pleasant and unpleasant?
Yeah, so what I found really helpful is the attitude of curiosity. So really wanting to know, really wanting to directly know the sensation as it is. So when we're caught up in fixation on pleasantness, so when we're obsessed with the pleasantness of something, then we're not really having the experience itself. Similarly, when we're caught up in the unpleasantness of something, we're so fixated on hating it that we're not really paying attention to it. We just want to get away from it. And when we're fixated on the pleasantness of something, we're so fixated on the pleasantness that we're actually generating a false image in our mind. A clear example of this, by the way, is if you've ever fallen in love with a person. When you first fall in love with a person, they seem like the most absolutely perfect, magnificent being in the entire world. They're radiantly beautiful. Every word they speak is delightful, like honey to your ears. Like everything about them is just magnificent. And then after a few weeks, you start to see, no, actually, they've got that mole in that weird place. That's not so beautiful. And oh, they just said something really stupid. And oh, and they're always late for everything. And then you start to realize, actually, they've been that way all along. It's not like the mole just spontaneously appeared on their face after you'd known them for 3 weeks. It's not like they started being late all the time after you knew them for 3 weeks. They were always late from day one. It's not like they only started saying stupid things after 3 weeks. Like it wasn't like they had a IQ 200 for 3 weeks and it suddenly plummeted to 110. Like they always had an IQ of 110. That was the way from the beginning. What was different was that because we were so fixated on pleasantness that we were deliberately ignoring everything else. So we generated a false image in our mind of what that person was, which admittedly, it's quite enjoyable. It's just utter delusion. It has nothing to do with reality. But at some point, reality starts catching up with us, and we start to acknowledge the way things really are. So it's the same. So like recently, Ayasoma destroyed the experience of ice cream for me. I've still never recovered from this. So Ayasoma said, normally when we eat ice cream, we're so fixated on the pleasantness of it. We're so fixated on the creaminess and the sweetness. And we completely miss the fact that actually what we're doing is putting this big freezing cold lump down our throat. And how unpleasant it is to have this freezing cold lump sliding down our throat. And ever since she said that, whenever I eat ice cream, I'm just noticing I'm just putting this like freezing cold lump of goo down my throat. And now it's really hard for me to actually enjoy a bowl of ice cream. So I know I'm supposed to be grateful to her for this, but I still haven't quite been able to produce gratitude. This is disenchantment, but I think I preferred the enchantment on that one. But this is the reality of things. The reality is that ice cream always had this unpleasant character. It's just that prior to that, I was usually so focused on the pleasantness that I wasn't aware of the unpleasantness of it. But actually, the sensation of a cold lump moving down your throat, that's not inherently unpleasant either. It's just a sensation. So whatever sensation you're having, develop a mind of curiosity, just really wanting to know exactly what it is. And recognize that whenever you're caught up in any kind of obsession, whether it's obsession with pleasantness or obsession with unpleasantness, then your mind becomes biased, distorted, and narrowed, which means you're no longer able to have a clear, true perception of things as they are. So you want to have the mind of a scientist. The ideal perfect scientist, of course, because scientists are not awakened beings, and so they make mistakes too. But the ideal scientist, when they're studying something, even if it's something utterly disgusting and revolting, they're not disgusted and revolted. They're just trying to know it for what it is. Or when they're studying something beautiful and amazing, they're not distracted by that beauty. They're just trying to understand what it really is. So that's the kind of attitude that we should be taking to every single experience that we have. We just really want to know exactly what's going on, to feel it in its full detail. In this way, you can start to get beyond pleasantness and unpleasantness. Another approach is to, when you're caught up in pleasantness, pay attention to the disturbance and agitation and discomfort of the mind. Because the obsession with that pleasantness, the obsession itself, makes the mind uncomfortable. Similarly, when we're caught up in obsession with unpleasantness, that aversion to a sensation, notice how unpleasant and uncomfortable the aversion is. So in this way, we start to lose interest in our reactivity. We recognize that our reactivity is making us uncomfortable. That's another way that you can start to approach equanimity. Okay? Joseph?
Does this also hold true for within neutrality? And notice being curious with neutrality and noticing if it's falling into a place of numbness or some form of aversion?
Yes, that's a very good point. So when practicing equanimity, there is the risk of falling into apathy, numbness, as you said. So the mind of curiosity helps to prevent that from happening. So equanimity must be accompanied by curiosity, or else the mind can start to become dull and vague and hazy. So apathy, it resembles equanimity in that the mind is not bothered by things. The difference is that equanimity has a sharpness and clarity of awareness. So true equanimity must be accompanied by very sharp mindfulness. So apathy is when you have something kind of like equanimity, so the mind is not really bothered by anything, but you also don't care about anything and you just don't want to know what's happening. So apathy carries a note of aversion and willful ignorance, whereas equanimity carries a note of, again, sharp mindfulness and interest. Okay? Yeah. Other questions?
Yes, tons.
Okay, maybe I need to give shorter answers then.
So Anita is asking another question that maybe you have already answered during the talk, but Bhante, would you say the practice of seeing things as they are be the practice of sanya, distortion?
I think I already spoke about that sufficiently.
Great.
Yeah.
And Michael says, I have always imagined that perception should come before feeling, because how can we have feelings about that which we haven't yet perceived?
So I think that the way I would relate to this is that Vedana is something very primal, whereas Sanya is something a little more complex, not quite yet intellectual, because intellectual is in the domain of Sankhara. But Vedana is like when you encounter something and you just have this immediate sense of liking or disliking, or neutrality. But you don't yet necessarily have any idea what it is. You just know that you either like it or you dislike it or you don't feel strongly about it. Then you identify like, oh, I'm touching someone's hand. But first you're like, oh, this feels nice. Then you're like, oh, I'm touching someone's hand. But the recognizing it as touching someone's hand comes after liking the experience. Now, of course, it can carry on from there. You might have an experience where at first you don't feel strongly about it, but then you realize, oh, this is my friend's hand. And then that brings up all your associations of how much you like your friend and how you appreciate that they're comforting you or supporting you or whatever. And then that can lead to you liking the sensation. So in that case, that would be sensation, that would be Vedana happening after Sanya. But there was already a Vedana that happened before Sanya. So the instant you have any kind of sensory experience, then you will tend to automatically react in one of three ways: liking, disliking, or neutrality. That's before you even have any idea what the sensation means. So Sanya is a little bit slower than Vedana. Vedana is almost instantaneous. Sanya is a little bit slower, because it involves some process of trying to identify what's happening. So that can take a few mind moments. Okay.
Thank you, Bhante. And we have Venerable Nandaratana Ntero.
Welcome.
Watching from Sri Lanka.
Great, great. Good to see you, Bhante.
And hello to Kevin. Good to see you, friend. And Ishi, hello. Janil, who has seen a banana tree.
Oh, okay, good.
And Girly, welcome. Shavindra asks, if no thoughts, what is the process of how mind functions as a person?
Can you repeat that?
If no thoughts, what's the process of how mind function as a person?
Well, first off, there is no person. So that's out of the picture entirely. Second, mind has many layers and processes. Thought is only the outermost layer, and it's the coarsest and least refined layer. There are much more subtle layers of mind and mental activity below that. And during meditation practice, one can start to get a very clear picture of those currents of mind. Yeah, I mean, as you practice meditation, it's usually not too long before you can start to have at least brief moments where you experience a mind free of thought, which nonetheless is clearly aware and clearly knowing. And in those moments where there's no thoughts and the mind is clear and aware, then you'll start to become, you'll start to know those deeper layers of mind, those deeper layers of mental activity. So you'll see it for yourself.
Thank you, Bhante. And Michael asks, speaking about themselves in third person, Michael, who likes a simple, orderly world, likes the translation choices because it's simple and easy to imagine.
It's also wrong.
I make choices based on the previous 3 Kandas. Not so great, eh?
Yeah, I mean, choices as a translation for Sankara, that's very inventive, but it's not very accurate. So it's true, choices are one kind of Sankara, but that only represents one tiny fragment. Kind of like if you translate the word color. Let's imagine you're translating the word color into another language, and you translate it as green. Well, it's true, green is a color, but green does not represent all colors. So it's not an accurate translation of the word color. So choices are an example of sankharas, but they don't represent all sankharas. It only represents one tiny, small percentage of what we call sankharas. Sankhara, in the context of the 5 aggregates, the 5 khandas, the 5 components of being, in this context, sankhara means mental activities and mental objects, mental phenomena, mental behaviors, mental formations. Choices is only one small component of that. Yes, honestly, I don't think choices is a very good translation.
Okay.
Sorry.
Thank you, Bhante. And Nancy asks, is there a thing as right passion? Is there such a thing as right passion?
Yeah, it's called Damaraga. So Damaraga is mentioned in a few places in the suttas. It's not very common, this term, but it does appear in a few places. So it means a passion for the Dhamma, lust for the Dhamma, obsession with the Dhamma. Dhammarati, yeah. Yeah, so we do find this term in a handful of places. So it's talking about somebody who has so much love and passion and obsession for the Dhamma that leads to a deep commitment to Dhamma practice. This is really wholesome. It's really wonderful. It is something which is a form of obsession. It is a form of attachment. But it's a form of obsession and attachment which will eventually lead you to abandoning all obsession and attachment. So that's a perfectly fine form of passion. Yeah.
Great, thank you, Bhante. And Eon asks, then what is the point of practicing metta?
Well, for that, I refer you to Bhante Kusala's wonderful talk yesterday morning about metta practice. Really delightful talk. Metta has many, many benefits. Metta well, for one thing, it prevents aversion. So aversion is one of the hindrances to samadhi practice. Aversion is also one of the 3 basic defilements of mind. So we need to deal with aversion sooner or later, and metta is a very good way of dealing with aversion. Metta also can be used as a samadhi object, so it can lead to very strong concentration if you use it correctly. Metta also just makes you a pleasant person, so it smooths over your social interactions quite a bit. So yeah, metta is very valuable. Of course, it has no substance and no essence, but that doesn't matter. It's still valuable, still useful. Okay.
Thank you, Bhante. And Michael asks, around 1965, I took off walking toward a city on one of the Iranian deserts that appeared to be more or less than 10 kilometers away. It was, in fact, well over 100 kilometers away. Actually, this was a comment, but pretty apt.
Yeah. Yeah, that shows you how the mind distorts its own experience of reality. To the point where you might do something like walk for 100 kilometers through a desert. I'm happy you survived.
Great. And Pial asks, does this sutta basically point to emptiness?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, this whole sutta is about sunyata. The Buddha just never uses that word at any point, but that's what he's talking about here, very clearly so. There's actually a lot of suttas in the Pali Canon where the Buddha is basically talking about emptiness. He just doesn't use that word particularly often.
Thank you, Bhante. And Mini asks, how to remain calm while suffering through sickness? There is nothing permanent, but since flesh hurts, so mind understands how to settle down in one's mind. I chant triple gems. Is there any sutta in which the Buddha speaks about how to face such circumstances steadfastly?
Yeah, so I mean, ultimately it comes down to mindfulness and equanimity. These are your basic tools for facing actually almost any situation, but especially difficult situations with unpleasant sensations. Yeah, and physical illness, physical pain of any sort definitely fit into this category. Mindfulness and equanimity. Be clearly aware of the sensations and completely accepting of them. Recognize that this is the nature of the body. The nature of the body is to get sick from time to time. So there's no way to be free of sickness. You can also, though, reflect. So Bhante Sumita was talking about karma the other day, yesterday evening, I believe. And he also mentioned that the way to have few sicknesses is to take care of other people. Try not to hurt anyone and do your best to take care of other people and look after their needs. And that creates the karmic conditions to have few illnesses, few afflictions, few health problems. So you can also do that. To the best of your ability, practice kindness and generosity and consideration and compassion for others. And then you'll find that you might get sick less often. And even when you do get sick, it doesn't bother you as much. And also reflecting on the triple gem, as you mentioned, is really good. So recollection of Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha bring a lot of joy and ease to the mind. Also recollection of your own goodness, your own generosity and virtue brings a lot of joy to the mind. Recollection of the devas can bring a lot of joy to the mind. Those are all valuable practices. But actually one really, really important thing when you're sick, stop wanting to get better. Just accept this is what the body feels like right now. and that's perfectly okay. Accept that you might be sick for the rest of eternity, and that's okay. Because once you fully accept it, then you're not bothered by it anymore. Okay. Any other questions? Oh, lots? Okay.
Pia says, when you said there is another meaning for sankhara, for example, any object out there, computer, TV, etc., is it because at the end, all these objects out there end up in the mind as thought processes, for example, mental volition, svachi sankhara, vitaka vichara, etc.?
Well, and if you want to be technical about it, absolutely everything is mind. Everything is in the mind. Everything is mind-made. Everything arises in the mind. So yeah, technically everything is a mental formation. That's technically true. But the Buddha gives the division of the 5 khandas as a framework for investigating our experience by breaking it down into smaller, manageable pieces. But yeah, it is technically true. Everything is mind, everything is mental phenomena. That's technically true.
Great. And well, the name is written in Khmer, so I will not be able to pronounce your name, but the question is in English. How be strongly to control our mind when it is sadness?
So there's a few things you can do. One is, as I mentioned earlier, to practice joyful meditation practices, such as recollection of the Buddha, the Dhamma, the Sangha, the Devas, your own generosity, your own virtue. Also practicing loving kindness meditation, practicing compassion meditation, practicing equanimity. But also a very important thing is to do actions of goodness. So do acts of kindness. Do kind things for others. Be generous to others. Be caring to others. Do things for other people. And that will do much to alleviate your sadness. And also just be aware of what sadness feels like. Recognize that sadness is just an object moving through the mind. Sadness is not you. It's just something that appears in the mind, and it changes, and it disappears. It is not you. It's just something that floats through the mind, like a cloud floating through the sky. The cloud is not the sky. It's just something that floats through the sky. So in the same way, sometimes sadness floats through the mind, but sadness is not you. It's just something that's floating through your field of awareness. Okay, anything else?
Yes, thank you, Bhante. Michael says, this Sankhara Kanda has always been a tough one for me. Do you think that wanting each Kanda to fit together in a strict order is the problem?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately all 5 of these define our nature of being. I wouldn't get too caught up in the order of them. I do see don't get too caught up in the order of them. Yeah, don't make a big deal about it.
Actually, that was his follow-up questions. Perhaps I'd get closer if I give up the idea that one leads to the next.
Yeah.
Okay. And Shavindra, I put the book, the name of the Venerable. I typed it in. Venerable Nyanananda. So you can Google him and find all his books. And the person with the Khmer name says that there's likely a water to make a cold, to make our hearts stay in peace, to love everyone in kindness.
Yeah, it helps tremendously. Yeah.
And Anita, I'm going to type in the phrase that Bhante had mentioned in Pali.
Nibindang virajati viragava muchati.
Correct. Okay, actually that was the last question, as everything else is a comment of happiness and delight in Dhamma, of Dhamma Sukha or Damaraga.
Great.
All right. Well, it's great seeing you all. So excited about Dhamma and so excited about this sutta. So it's wonderful to see so many different practitioners coming together first thing in the morning or first thing at night, actually, if you're on the other side of the globe, all to ask really important questions. If you have any other lingering questions, you can tune in tonight at 7:30 p.m. New York City time. And there will be monk chat. So there will be a panel of monastics that will try their best to answer any questions you might have. So you can type in anything related to Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha, or anything that you've always been curious to ask monastics, and we'll try our best to answer it. And if you're around the monastery this weekend, well, as usual, every Saturday at 6 p.m. we have a meditation and Dhamma talk led by one of the resident monastics. And on Sunday, this Sunday afternoon, we'll have an afternoon of mindfulness. So there will be meditation, Dhamma talk, and more intensive practice for 3 or 4 hours in the afternoon on Sunday. So then you can join in next week. Basically every... Oh, I forgot. Actually, tomorrow we have the first... of a series of classes for Venerable Sakyadhamma on the introduction to Abhidhamma. So Venerable Sakyadhamma is a bhikkhuni from India who is part of the Chatu Purisa Foundation. So we're very excited to have her, and she will be leading every Saturday, 10:30 a.m. New York City time. There will be 1 hour of Dhamma study and discussion with Venerable. So yeah, don't forget, be there online, and then every day, basically 8 a.m. and 7:30 p.m. New York City time, there is either a live stream or a recording from our past teachers. And so these days we're broadcasting Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi's teachings from past retreats. All right, well, we can end with 3 sadhus.
Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.